Okay, in this unit we're going to continue our cell topic, but transitioning away from the organelles, which is what we looked at last time, and focusing just on the plasma membrane and how it can control transport of materials, whether large or small, through the membrane for functionality reasons. So let's go ahead and get started. Remember, the cell membrane in the plant cell is actually covered by the the cell wall. The cell wall actually has pores in it that allows for this process to occur, to allow for transport to occur, because things have to be able to get past the cell wall to make it to the cell membrane. The cell membrane of the animal cell has no covering around it, so it's actually interacting with the outside environment around the cell and the inside environment of the cell. So there is no other blanket or layer other than the cell membrane when you're looking at animal cells. Quick review. Remember the parts of the cell membrane. We know it has two layers. That's why it's called the bilayer. It has the phospholipids, part of lipids, hydrophobic and hydrophilic. Allow for water movement when it wants to, stops it otherwise. It has proteins that aid in movement as well. Here's another look at it. Looking at the proteins, looking at the receptors, those glycolipids, things that we've covered before. We know it has this bilayer, this dual layer of protection, but it is semi-permeable or selectively permeable, so it can choose what passes through it. If there are things, nutrients, materials, particles that are too large to pass through by the aid of water, then they can use these channel proteins. So these are parts that we'll be looking at as we go. So we know that the membrane, it helps regulate what enters and leaves the cell. It is double layered. We know it's formed of lipids. We know there are proteins that act as channels and pumps. And there are those glycolipid carbohydrate chains that are cell identifiers. It's a quick review. The cell membrane is also known as a fluid mosaic model, if you will, which means roughly that it allows water to continuously move in and out of the cell, transporting materials as needed, but then it can be selective on that stuff as well. So it's a continual movement, a continual balance. As I mentioned earlier, we know the cell wall. It surrounds the cell membrane of your plant cell. It does have pores embedded within the cell wall that allows for things to move in and out, so it's not blocking the cell membrane for interacting with the outside cell. We did talk about cellulose before. Just so a quick review, we know cellulose is the material that makes up the cell wall. It is that carbohydrate that gives the fiber and the structure to the cell wall. We know cell walls are found in plants. They can also be found in algae, fungi, and certain other prokaryotes. Okay, so this is other things you can find, or just examples of where you can find cell walls. All right. Let's get back to proteins, or to get back to our membranes, this transport process and how it works. Remember, our membrane is permeable, which means it can allow certain substances to pass through, usually substances that are water-based, kind of like a strainer, if you've ever used a strainer, or if you've used a fish net or something, you can pour water and the water will strain through. I've mentioned selectively permeable before. That is the term we coined to the membrane, because it can choose what passes through the membrane. Everything is water-based. Water is always moving in and out of the cell, but the cell membrane can choose what the water carries in and what the water carries out. If things are too big, if they don't have the right charge, if they're not supposed to be in that cell, it can stop those things from moving in. All right, there's two main pathways that materials can move in and out of a cell. The first pathway is called passive transport. And this is what happens all the time with water. Water is constantly moving in and out of cells of an organism. Within our body, within animal bodies of animals and plants, water is constantly moving in and out to maintain homeostasis and equilibrium. This movement doesn't need energy, okay? And so since it doesn't need energy for this movement to occur, it's going to be considered passive transport. Here's just a nice picture. You see a small molecule in water. Okay, this small molecule is dissolved in water, and as water flows through the membrane, this molecule can also be passed through the membrane. It can pass from inside the membrane to outside of the cell. It can pass from outside of the cell through the membrane to the inside of the cell. As long as it doesn't require energy and it's small enough, it's going to be passive transport. You can also use those proteins. Remember we talked about types of proteins in the cell membrane. You can also use those channel proteins to allow particles that might be just a tad too big to pass through dissolved in water through the cell membrane, but they can still pass through without needing energy through these channel proteins to get to the inside of the cell, or vice versa if they're moving from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. As long as they don't need energy, they can travel these two pathways, and that's passive transport. There's other types of proteins called carrier proteins that are built specifically, kind of like opening a gate and shutting the gate on one side, and it's almost exact same as channel proteins, but they're almost like gates where this gate will open, allow the protein or allow the material in, and then it'll open up on the inside and let the material pass through. And then vice versa. If it's on the inside of the cell, it can do the same thing to move to the outside of the cell. So they can just pass through the membrane unaided. They can pass through the membrane using channel proteins, and they can also pass through the membrane using transport proteins. Okay, active transport is the other type of transport that cell membranes can use to move things in and out of the cell. Active transport requires energy. Okay, just like this little girl is full of energy, the active transport process has to have energy to move larger molecules through the cell membrane. Okay, either in or out. So passive transport does not require energy. It's a passive process. Active transport, you have to use energy. Okay, usually when you have active transport occurring, it is going to occur using these protein pumps, a type of protein that can pump materials through the membrane. Okay, but as it opens up, kind of like a channel protein does, but it's going to require energy because, and we're going to talk about in a minute why, for this channel protein to work. And so you have to add energy to that protein, to the active side of that protein, to make this pump work, this protein work, to move things through the cell membrane actively. So that's how the energy is used in active transport. Okay, there's an active site, just like our enzymes, our proteins that we talked about when we talked about enzymes. There is an active site that energy is going to be added to make that protein pump work. All right, so those are the two types, passive transport and active transport. Let's focus back on passive transport now and look at some examples of passive transport. There's three main examples. You can have passive transport through the cell membrane through diffusion, through osmosis, and through facilitated diffusion. Diffusion, think about this for example. All right, say I were to walk into the room, you guys are already sitting down. Say I were to walk into the room and I had just picked up a pizza from Pizza Hut. Okay, it's hot, it's fresh, you can see the steam coming off of it, and I were to walk in the room with that pizza and I were to stand by the front door, you would eventually be able to smell that pizza all the way in the back of the room. Okay, or say for example, someone were to come into the room to drop off something, and they had a lot of perfume on or a lot of cologne on, and they stayed for a couple of minutes and then they left. If they stayed up at the front of the room, eventually you would still be able to smell that perfume or that cologne all the way in the back of the room. Those are examples of diffusion. The way diffusion works is you have these concentrated particles, okay? Say the concentrated smell of the perfume or the concentrated smell of the pizza. And the way particles move in a liquid, air is a liquid, water's liquid, same thing. The way particles move in a liquid is they move down a concentration gradient, which means they flow from a highly concentrated area to a lower concentrated area. So if you think about it, if you've ever done that before, say you're driving down the road and the windows are down, you start coming up to a restaurant and you can eventually smell the food that's cooked at that restaurant, and as you go on you don't smell it anymore. What's happening is the smell, say the smell from the pizza or the smell from the perfume up in the front of the room, is really highly concentrated in that area. Well, those particles that carry that smell are going to move through the air, move through the liquid from that higher concentrated area to an area that's lower, that has a lower concentration. So they're going to spread from where the pizza is in the pizza box at the front of the room all the way to the back of the room. They're moving from a highly concentrated area to a lower concentrated area. That's called the concentration gradient. And in nature, all things do this. If it's in, say you have a high concentration of something in water, it's going to flow to a lower concentrated area. It's going to balance itself out. All right, eventually the pizza smell is going to be all over the room, and you'll smell it just as strong in the back of the room that you do in front of the room. All right, that's balancing out. That's becoming equalized, if you will, with those particles in that solution. Okay, so like I just mentioned, diffusion is where particles are going, or molecules are going to move from a higher concentrated area to a lower concentrated area, and that happens naturally. It does not require energy, so it is passive transport. They're moving down that concentration gradient. I mentioned the term solution, so these are some terms. You're talking about a solute and a solvent. We've heard of these before. We've talked about them before, but here they are again. We know a solute is a substance being dissolved. Solvent is the liquid that is doing the dissolving, and the solution is when they're mixed together. The solvent and solute are mixed together. So, say the smell of the pizza is the solute. Okay, the solvent is the air in the room, and then once the smell of the pizza has moved through the entire room, your solution is going to be the mixture of the air and the smell of the pizza. I've mentioned equilibrium a couple times. Okay. Equilibrium within a cell being in homeostasis, is when you have particles moving through the cell membrane without any energy added to them. They are moving down that concentration gradient. They are constantly flowing to maintain equilibrium, and there's no net change. Okay, which means there's no change with outside the cell or with inside the cell. There is a constant movement of water in and out of the cell to maintain equilibrium, and it's always moving things in and out. It's always moving different particles, molecules in and out of the cell to make sure that the inside of the cell is maintaining balance with what is outside of the cell. Here's a picture of how diffusion works. Okay, you've got your highly concentrated particles. In this case, we're in water, and we have orange coloring. You have something that is acting as a selectively permeable membrane. These highly concentrated color molecules are eventually going to cross that membrane. Remember, the water is moving back and forth across the membrane, and it's going to carry those molecules back and forth until eventually there is an equilibrium, or there's a balance between what's on one side of the membrane and what's on the other. That's diffusion. Same thing in this picture, or in this example. You've got two different colors. Okay, one is concentrated on one side, one on the other. They balance each other out until there's a balance of both colors on both sides of the membrane.